In 2013, Tim Hortons lobbied the Canadian government on temporary foreign worker criteria. 1 year later, 3G Capital paid $12.5 billion for the company. Your neighborhood location cycled out the woman who opened 6 days a week for 2 years. She was replaced under a closed work permit that made it illegal for the worker to quit without facing deportation. Tim Hortons shaped the rules, paid lawyers to design the criteria, then deployed the program across thousands of locations. They built the cage before they bought the birds. But this story does not start with a government program. It starts with a donut shop. It was 1964 and Tim Horton was a defenseman for the Toronto Maple Leafs with a side business idea and almost no money. One location in Hamilton, Ontario, coffee and donuts. That was it. 3 years later, a former police officer named Ron Joyce became his partner. When Horton died in a car crash in 1974, Joyce bought out his family's shares for $1 million and took over a chain of 40 stores. What Joyce built over the next 2 decades was not a restaurant chain, it was a Canadian institution. By 1991, the 500th store had opened. In 1986, Roll Up the Rim launched as a spring promotion at 246 locations, and it became an annual national ritual that Canadians planned around. The double-double became its own vocabulary, a word every Canadian understood without explanation. By 2013, Tim Hortons operated over 3,500 locations in Canada alone, more than twice as many as McDonald's. Revenue that year hit $3 billion. Canadian Business named it the best-managed brand in the country 2 years running. At that point, there was no plausible version of the future in which this brand lost Canada. The numbers made it look permanent. But the numbers are not the point. The point is what it felt like at 6 in the morning. You knew the person behind the counter, not by sight, by name. They knew your order before you reached the register. The regulars had tables, not assigned, just understood. The staff knew which ones were going through something hard that week and which ones just wanted their coffee and quiet. That kind of knowledge does not come from a training manual. It comes from years of the same people showing up in the same place for the same community. Pierre Berton, one of Canada's most celebrated writers, put it plainly. In so many ways, he said, the story of Tim Hortons is the essential Canadian story. A story of hard work and small towns and old-fashioned values. He was not wrong about what it had been. He could not have known what was coming. In December 2014, a Brazilian-American private equity firm called 3G Capital completed a $12.5 billion acquisition of Tim Hortons and merged it with Burger King under a new holding company called Restaurant Brands International. The deal was framed publicly as a growth partnership. In financial circles, everyone who knew 3G Capital's history understood exactly what it was. 3G Capital's operational tool is called zero-based budgeting. Every year, every expense starts at zero and must be re-justified from scratch. Nothing carries over. Nothing is protected. Not heritage, not culture, not the things that made the company worth buying in the first place. They had run this playbook before. In 2013, alongside Berkshire Hathaway, they acquired Heinz for $28 billion and cut 600 corporate jobs within months, closing 3 manufacturing plants, including the Leamington, Ontario facility that had employed 740 people. Before that, they had done the same to Anheuser-Busch and Burger King, cutting thousands of jobs, gutting investment, and leaving franchisees complaining for years afterward. Every time, the same formula. Every time, the same result. By the time they arrived at Tim Hortons, they had a manual. In Canada, they found something their American playbook had never had access to at the same scale, a government program that would solve the labor problem permanently. The Federal Lobbying Registry shows that Tim Hortons had been lobbying on the temporary foreign worker program since at least 2013, on the number of workers permitted entry, on the criteria for approval, and on pathways to permanent residency. They were not passive recipients of a government policy. They were participants in shaping it. Once the rules were in place, they started using them. Canadian workers who had built their careers inside Tim Hortons stores began describing the same pattern around 2015 and 2016. Hours got cut, schedules shifted. The conditions that made long-term employees want to stay started eroding quietly, without announcement, without explanation. Long-term staff left. Some were pushed out directly, and some read the writing early enough to leave on their own terms. Either way, they were gone. What replaced them was a rotating workforce with no institutional knowledge of the location, the regulars, or the community. Customers felt that gap immediately, even when they could not name what had changed. In 2018, something happened that looked briefly like a turning point. The Ontario minimum wage increase triggered a public backlash from several franchise owners who cut benefits and paid breaks in response. Workers walked out. The story went national. Then the news cycle moved on. The provincial government backed down, and the pipeline kept running. What filled the gap was already there. The temporary foreign worker program had been running inside Tim Hortons locations for years before 3G Capital arrived. Fast food chains had figured out by the early 2000s that a program designed for remote farms and seasonal harvests could be applied to urban restaurant locations with no shortage of local workers at all. What 3G Capital did was take that program and run it across nearly 4,000 locations as an operational strategy. But the reason those workers could not fight back, could not negotiate, could not even quit, had nothing to do with wages. That is not the mechanism. Workers brought in through the temporary foreign worker program hold what is called a closed work permit. That permit is tied to a single specific employer. A temporary foreign worker at your corner Tim Hortons cannot quit and take a job at the location down the street. They cannot negotiate better conditions. They cannot threaten to leave if hours get cut. They cannot walk out after a bad shift and find something better. If they lose that one position with that specific employer, they lose the legal right to work in Canada. Their ability to remain depends entirely on keeping that job. University of Waterloo economist Mikhail Skuderud described the situation directly. Temporary foreign workers have no right to go anywhere else. By 2024, the federal government used its own language to describe what that structure had enabled. When announcing a major tightening of the program, Ottawa said explicitly that the reforms were designed to weed out misuse and fraud. For a company running zero-based budgeting across nearly 4,000 Canadian locations, a workforce that legally cannot leave is not a side benefit. It is the entire point. In 2024, a UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, reporting to the Human Rights Council, described the closed permit structure as a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery because the power imbalance between employer and worker is built into the design by intent, not by accident. The franchisees caught in the middle of this were not the architects of the pipeline. They were trapped inside it. Corporate pushed labor cost targets following the acquisition that were increasingly impossible to hit with standard Canadian hires at minimum wage. For franchisees already running on razor margins, paying combined royalty and advertising fees of 8 to 10% of gross revenue before a single operational expense, the gap between what corporate demanded and what the local labor market could provide was not a business problem. It was a survival problem. Some wanted to hire locally. The targets made it nearly impossible without absorbing losses that stores running on single-digit margins could not sustain. The pipeline became the path of least resistance, not by choice, but by financial design. The structure of their franchise left them no other exit. The Great White North Franchisee Association, representing roughly half of Canadian franchise owners, eventually went public. They accused corporate of profiting while stores bled. They filed a $500 million class action lawsuit. Corporate settled, then stripped the association president of his 4 locations. He received 4 minutes notice. That is what pushing back cost. Restaurant Brands International posted revenue growth of 38% between 2015 and 2019. Tim Hortons' same-store sales fell 4.3% in a single quarter. The stores were bleeding. The parent company was fine. And through all of it, the maple leaf stayed on the cup. The hockey imagery stayed in the ads. Roll Up the Rim kept running every spring, though it moved to an app in 2020, so you no longer roll anything. The language of Canadian identity kept going in every press release, every campaign, every interview with RBI executives, while the workforce that had given that identity its substance was quietly cycled out. These were workers who legally could not leave, in stores run by franchisees who financially could not resist, and under a corporate structure that calculated the extraction was worth more than the institution. When people say Tim Hortons does not feel Canadian anymore, they are told they are being nostalgic, that businesses change, that customers adapt. But what you were describing in the comments was not nostalgia, it was the precise record of a loss. The person who knew your name, the staff member who had been there since the location opened, the sense that you were walking into a place that used to hold the shape of your community and now held nothing of the kind. You felt it before you had the word for it. Ron Joyce borrowed $10,000 from a credit union in 1965 to open his first franchise and said he knew zero about making donuts. He learned in a hurry. He built something that Pierre Berton called the essential Canadian story, a story of hard work and small towns and old-fashioned values. The company that owns it now is headquartered in Toronto. The workforce pipeline that staffs the stores was built around a government program designed for northern mines and seasonal farms. And the people who used to know your name when you walked in are long gone. That is not the essential Canadian story. That is what was replaced. If this is the kind of story you came back for, subscribe. These stories do not trend. They get buried.